you. Hey, Janet, how are you today?
I'm good. A little crazy trying to get, I know you've been traveling and I had Hargray
Right.
we had our Hargray internet connection cut. So getting that hooked back up so we could do this. But we were just commenting that this is our 32nd webinar and we've had all this drama so many days, and yet they've all gone off without a hitch. So
I know we're very blessed. I cannot believe we started these webinars, our author series for Wahi back in May of 2020.
yeah,
We are
yeah.
in September 2023. It is our 32nd. And I just want to remind ladies that we will officially start with Joy Callaway at 5 o'clock. And I'm Robin Zimmerman, along with my colleague Janet Porter, who actually will conduct the interview. And we've got quite a few ladies signed up. And again, we'll start promptly at 5. But until then, Janet and I are just going to catch up a little bit. I want to begin by thanking Janet for the great job that she did at the luncheon with another author. So it was delightful. You did a great job. You want to tell us a little bit about how it all came down, Janet?
Well, we were so thrilled to have Patty Callahan Henry, and I was especially thrilled because we booked her. She lives in Atlanta and in Bluffton, so she's gracious to do a lot of community service here. And we booked her before her book had come out, and we had read it. And I walked into the first week of May. I walked into the Barnes of Noble in Minneapolis. And they had a whole table of Patty Callahan Henry books, and I was like, "Oh my gosh!" And it turned out that was the Barnes and Noble Book of the Month,
Oh,
and it was
wow.
picked in People magazine as one of the top books to read for the first week of May. So we lucked out and got her on, a great book called The Secret Book of Flora Lee.
Right.
And it's gotten great reviews and, been picked up and won awards, and I think was on the New York Times bestseller list. So we booked her like 9 months in advance, and you
Right.
don't know, about what the book is when that happens. She's a great author, but you're not sure.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
it worked out really well. And it was wonderful also because we had a whole theme of books, and we had wonderful book table decorations, and then Amanda Dickman, who's our Beaufort County Library Director, spoke about particularly about the children's reading programs at the library. And she is just a gem. I'm vice chair of the board for the
Right.
library, and she's such a good speaker. And we encourage everyone to frequent our libraries because they're, gems of our community.
And you had the little library, so women brought in books, and I'm not sure difference makers how many books they gathered, but I think it was several hundred, right?
I think they said over 500 books they
Oh my
gathered
gosh.
for little libraries all across the community. So difference makers. So it was a really nice event. And I think doing an event like that every year, we have so many readers in Wahi. And I think every year, in fact, I already have in mind who we should have next year as our author. Um, um, but always having an author and featuring them is,
Yes,
I think
yes.
a great idea for us.
And Luann Rosenfeld is our program chair this year, and she did a great job. You were at the Country Club of Hilton Head. Of course, the interest group leaders were there, and women continue to have an opportunity to sign up for various interest groups. And I'm just very excited about what I'm seeing coming across my email of all the great connections WAHI, the Women's Association of Hilton Head, is making with so many community groups. I mean, just a lot of diversity, a lot just, I mean, from the chef series to, of course, the author series to dance to all kinds of exciting opportunities for our women this year. So I'm not on the council this year, but I just, kudos to the new president and you, Janet, you're the secretary. So, good job.
Well, I do want to do, since you mentioned that, I do want to do one little promotion. Maybe not everybody is aware that of TED Talks, and TED Talks take place across the United States, and communities can sponsor TED Talks. And what they are is brief 15-minute presentations about an idea. They're idea generating, and
Idea
they are
worth
so, pardon me?
ideas worth sharing, right?
Ideas worth sharing, yeah. So we're selling tickets to TED Talks, and they're the same price that you would get for the public, but TED has agreed to give a donation to our foundation for our scholarships for every ticket sold. And we sold 20. The last I checked, we had sold 20 and we have 30 good seats reserved. So I would encourage people to check out the partnership that we have with TED. We had that last year too.
Mhm.
And you may remember I was one of the
You were one of
speakers.
the speakers, yes,
Yeah.
on End of
So
Life. Mhm.
yeah, so there were about 400 people there. This time it's at the Carolina Arts Center this year,
Oh, is it?
as
Okay.
opposed to the high school. It's at the Carolina Arts Center. So I would encourage you to look up TED Talks, and it doesn't take place till November. I think it's November 4th, but you
I
can
think
find it in
so.
our events calendar.
Right. I think so. That was I love TED Talks. I love to go back and listen to TED Talks from really around the world. It's a wonderful, wonderful program and initiative. And Janet, you did a super job last year. You working, of course, with Hospice Care of the Low Country, and we were talking about end of life. I have a dear friend's husband is in hospice up in Greenville, and she just when we were talking to her yesterday, and she was just going on and on about the wonderful care that he was getting. It was kind of a surprise to us, but just good work from hospice care. But again, back to the TED Talk event. It will be, I think it is November 4th. I'm glad it'll be the Arts Center. I think that will be a nice venue for it.
Yeah, it'll be classy. It was classy last year too.
Yeah.
But it's nice for Wahi to connect with members to various community events like the theater events. You did
Oh, I
such a good
know.
job last year, Robin,
Thanks.
connecting us to the Lean Ensemble and to other theater groups and getting us connected and to the Carolina Arts Center. And that's interesting because that's our theme this year. That's the theme that
I
actually
know.
was picked, is connections.
Mhm. That's wonderful. Well, y'all are doing a great job. I will remind everyone we're going to start promptly in 5 minutes. So this is Janet and our time just to kind of catch up and chit chat, and then we will introduce our guest author at right at 5 o'clock, Joy Callaway. Her book is called The Grand Design, a novel of Dorothy Draper, and we'll again find out more about that at 5. But what books have you been reading lately, Janet?
Well, I will tell you that I always try to think of a book that I've read that I know this isn't a word, but I love the word unput downable, as if that should be a word,
Unput
And
downable.
I know
Okay.
that's not good English, but the book Never Lie by Frida McFadden is unput downable, and I would highly recommend it. And I don't normally recommend movies or shows, but I have to tell you, if you are on Netflix or YouTube, you have got to read, and you are having a down day. The thing you need to do is is Google Leanne Morgan. Leanne Morgan. She is a comedian, and she talks about menopause and
Oh
her
gosh.
kids and getting old and fat and everything. And
Right.
she is absolutely hysterical. She is so funny. I have watched her videos. Like if I'm having a bad day, I'll watch a video that I have already seen of hers just
Mhm.
because she's so funny. Leanne Morgan. So she's just talks about everyday life
Well,
and
and
she gets you laughing.
I told you earlier in the week that my husband Len and I had seen Golda, the movie. Uh,
Yes,
Helen Mirren. Did you go see it? Have you
I
seen it?
did not, and I've been traveling, and I'm so sorry I haven't
Oh,
seen it.
Helen Mirren is absolutely amazing. The makeup, the costume, the shoes, she passed in 78 with cancer. And it is like a docudrama, but Helen Mirren, if she doesn't get nominated for an Academy Award, I really didn't know, of course, what was going on in the early 70s with Israel and Egypt as detailed as the movie brought forth. But it was, so if you get a chance, go to the theater and watch Golda. Um, and then I just want to remind everyone that we're always looking for recommendations. Bobby Helbig does a great job for our authors, and she's still has a few little slots left in our year. And as you know, we have our author series every other month. So our next one will be in November. When we started out 3 years ago, we were once a month, and then we just thought, well, let's just kind of take a month off, and so we're now every other month. And again, Bobby and of course, Janet, you're part of the team, and Nancy Fowler, everyone does a super job of bringing this, our 32nd edition to Our Ladies of Wahi. And with that, I guess we're going to go ahead and begin, unless you have any kind of final words before I officially introduce you, Janet.
I just want to do a punchline because I know you're going to do this at the end, but our November author is my favorite author we have ever interviewed. It's William Kent Kruger. He is a best-selling author. He's written 20 books. I have read all of them. And I am so, I owe it to Bobby Helbig. I said, Bobby, this is the person that I really want to interview. And Bobby tracked him down and got him to commit, and good for Bobby. And Bobby asked me to remember, I just want to remind you, this, for those of you who are new, this is interactive. So we want you to feel free to ask questions. So go to your bottom of your screen and look at your Q&A and ask questions, because I can see them as I'm interviewing Joy. And I'd be glad to ask your questions for those of you who haven't joined us before. So with that, I'm going to
welcome all of you. We would like to welcome all of you to the 32nd edition of the Women's Association of Hilton Head Islands author series. Yes, we began in May of 2020 with our first author, and this has been a thrill for Janet and myself and Nancy Fowler, Bobby Helbig, to bring you these best-selling authors every other month. And as Janet just mentioned, we do want you to be involved. We would like you to ask questions, so please feel free to do that. And Janet will bring those questions to the author that she interviews. And we're excited to have Joy Callaway with us. It's kind of a little different approach. It is a book about the Greenbrier. And the book is called The Grand Design, a novel of Dorothy Draper. And she was the designer. She actually, it's a biography of Dorothy Draper. And it's a very interesting book. And I believe Janet has read it several times. And Bobby, of course, found this author for us. And Joy is coming to us on our Zoom in just a moment. Just to remind you, this is a webinar, which means you can see us, but we cannot see you. And so we want you to be involved. We want you to participate. And so you can do that by asking questions. And so, again, we appreciate Joy for taking time out of her busy schedule to be part of our webinar for September. So with that, I'm going to bring in Janet Porter, who is, as I always introduce her, as the interviewer extraordinaire. So Janet, you look very colorful today. Actually, we kind of complement each other, you with your yellow and your flowery top. So thank you so much for participating and being my colleague in these wonderful author series, our 32nd one today on September 4th.
kind of like Hoda and Savannah. You know?
Oh, no, we're a tad older. Just a tad.
We are? I don't think we are.
So with that, I'll be back at the end of the webinar to sign off. But again, we appreciate all of you ladies for joining us today, and you're in for a treat. And with that, Janet, it's all in your hands, my dear. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. So let me tell you a little bit about Joy before she joins us. Joy tells us that her love of storytelling came from her parents, who insisted on both reading and storytelling. She formerly served as the director of marketing for a wealth management company. She has a bachelor's degree in journalism and public relations from Marshall University and a master's in mass communication from University of South Carolina. She lives in Charlotte with her husband and 2 children. She's the author of numerous books, including The Fifth Avenue Artist Society, Secret Sisters, and her most recent book is called All the Pretty Places. She happens to be and is proud to be an 8th generation West Virginian, which is, as many of you know, is home of the Greenbrier. So Joy, please join us.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us, Joy. I want to read a quick quote about this book to set the stage for our conversation, if that's okay with you.
That sounds great.
So this is from Christy Woodson Harvey, who many of you probably know. And she said, She said the grand design is a backstage peek into the life of one of America's most famous designers and most glittering hotels. The grand design is a spellbinding tale of a woman's quest to escape the confines of upper crust society and make her own way in the world. Joy Callaway effortlessly captures the essence of Dorothy Draper, a woman who was determined to live her life on her own terms and change the field of interior design forever in the process. With vivid characters, illuminating prose, and perfect pacing, this novel is as captivating and confident as the heroine at its center. Callaway shines as a masterful storyteller. So with that introduction,
Thank you.
I think
Yeah, that
we've
was a great one
captivated
from
everyone
Christy.
here. So tell us where you are right now. Are you in Charlotte?
I'm in Charlotte. Yes, I've born and raised here in Charlotte. And the funny thing is, I always tell people I didn't go very far because we ended up, my husband and I bought my parents' house that I grew up in. So my kids are in my bedroom and my brother's bedroom. It's kind of crazy, but I was always the type that thought, I don't know where I'll end up. I'll go, wherever. And I ended up right where I started. So
Oh my
little
gosh.
thing. Yep.
So you were raised in Charlotte, but you consider yourself a West Virginian.
Yes. So my parents are both from Charleston, West Virginia. My husband's from Beckley. And when we were growing up, so my grandparents actually, we spent every holiday in Charleston and I loved it. It was kind of my home away from home. Every time I was there, I thought to myself, I just like to stay. And from the time I was a little kid, I thought, I know I want to go to college in West Virginia somewhere. We ended up actually having, so my parents have a lake house up there in West Virginia too. And it's 2 houses down from my grandparents who also have a house there. And so in the summers, we would spend so much time up there. And then when I got older and went to college, I went to Marshall and Huntington, West Virginia, and met my husband who's from Beckley. And so, we're up there as much as we possibly can. We love it. It's totally our heart home. And so I love Charlotte too. It's where I grew up. It's where I'm familiar. It's got great people and great weather, but we love West Virginia and we have deep roots there. So anytime I get to spend there, even fictionally, when I was writing the grand design or even in person, it's a gift.
Yeah. So I am confident that most of the people who are in our webinar today have heard of the Greenbrier or visited, but there are some who probably have not heard from it. We had the joy of being there to celebrate my husband's 75th birthday, and we took friends from Minnesota to the Greenbrier, and they had never heard of it. So, let's start by having you give a description of the Greenbrier before we get into the role that Dorothy Draper played in its renaissance.
Of course. So, personally for me, the Greenbrier is such a place of so many memories, stretching almost as many generations back as my family's been in West Virginia. We have negatives of my great grandparents there on their honeymoon, and then we go there on their reunions now. But for those who don't know what it is, the Greenbrier actually was started in the 1700s, the late 1700s, and it was built around Sulphur Springs. And people went there for healing most of the time to take the waters. And it started out really as a summer retreat for the wealthy and the influential in our country. Most presidents throughout time went there, even from the early 1800s on. It started out where people would own their own cottages there, and it centered around the springs, and it centered around healing and wellness. And then it started over time becoming a place of, where society gathered in the summer. There were no mosquitoes there. That was a really nice thing. People ended up showing up. Pretty soon, they built a hotel there. That hotel was actually not used mostly as a hotel. It was mostly used for gathering. It was mostly used for dining and for dances. And that was in the mid 1800s. So it kept expanding. It was actually, that hotel was used by both sides during the Civil War as an army hospital, which is really interesting. But then the Greenbrier, as we know it today, is a large hotel, and it was built in 1913. The cottages still stand on the grounds. The grounds are massive. but the hotel itself was built in 1913, the one that still stands today. The old hotel for a time stood beside it, and that hotel was actually not suitable for year-round stay. It didn't have capabilities for heat or air conditioning, and so after a while it was actually condemned and torn down. But while that hotel was standing, an interesting fact about that is it actually had the largest dining room in America at one point. And that was really fascinating. Everything that happened at the Greenbrier was written about in papers nationwide, because you had people like the Vanderbilts coming during the Gilded Age. You had presidents coming. You had foreign diplomats visiting. It was a place of tremendous influence. And so if you ever have a chance to go, I recommend it, because it's fascinating inside and out. When you walk in the doors, you're going to be greeted with cheery designs decorated by Dorothy Draper. And we'll get to that, I'm sure, in a second. But to everyone else, just talking about the hotel, it's a magnificent place. I think everyone should see at least once.
United States is full of grand dame historic hotels. You know, like the one on Mackinac Island, and, you know, Mount Washington Inn in New England. But of all of them, the Greenbrier is really the grand dame, and the grand dame partly because of the connection to the government. So talk a little bit about the governmental connection, and the fact that there's a train that goes right to Wright Sulphur Spring and drops you off right at the base of the hill where the hotel is.
That's right. So, you know, as I mentioned earlier, from such an early time in its history, the Greenbrier was really a place for influential people to come, and that included people from it included congressmen, senators, it included presidents and vice presidents. It was a place where people could kind of go away and retreat. And the way I like to explain it is, you know, when you're in business and you can get a lot done in an office, you can get a lot done in a meeting at an office, but you get more done when you're on a retreat with somebody. You get more done when you're having coffee together and you get to know that person on a more relaxed scale. And the Greenbrier, to me, what happened throughout history with the Greenbrier is it became a place that if you were trying to either influence or learn or figure out what was going on in government, you went to the Greenbrier in the summertime because everybody was there and they were relaxing. And you got to know these people. Now, I didn't write about this in the book much. I did nod to it a little bit. For those who haven't read it, I won't really get into it too much, but I do nod to this part of history that I don't discuss in the book, and that is the congressional bunker that's there. That bunker was actually built in the 1950s secretly. They said it was going to be another wing of the hotel for conferences and stuff like that. It really is. It still was used for that purpose, but beneath it was a bunker that was going to be used. It was for the Cold War. During the Cold War, they were worried, of course, about nuclear fallout. So they had a bunker built under the Greenbrier secretly so that Congress could come in on the train from DC, get off, and hide. And for years and years, it was just a complete secret. Now, people that lived in White Sulphur will tell you that they had an inkling something was going on, but no one said a word about it. In fact, the only people who knew for sure, besides obviously the uppers in the government, were two people posing as TV repairmen who would hang out in the Greenbrier and kind of monitor shipments, because what they would do is they would stockpile everybody's, you know, medicines, all the congressmen's medicines that they would need in case of, you know, an emergency. They'd bring in food that you would need for years and years and years. So they kept switching that out over time. So the Greenbrier has a very deep history with the government for sure. And I still contend that it does today somehow, even though we may not know what it is.
Yeah, that took place as the retreat to sustain the government in the event of nuclear war, with Washington being bombed or other places being bombed, with the fear of the Cold War during the Eisenhower administration. And of course, Eisenhower being a general, they created that safe space for Congress to sustain government. It was exposed in the 90s by reporters as the bunker for the federal government. And it's no longer used in that regard. So when you go there, you can go on a tour of the bunker and see what the plans were for Congress to be sustained in the event of nuclear war. So that's a little bit about the background of the history. But the book, let's talk about the grand design and Dorothy Draper and who she is. So the book really takes place in two time periods, in 1908 and then in 1947. So talk about why you decided to set the stage for this book in those two eras.
So it's my first time actually writing a dual timeline novel. And the reason I always told my agent was because when I read a dual timeline, I usually am really interested in one time period and really bored by the other. So I kind of wanted, I shied away from writing those because I thought, oh no, I'm going to bore someone with one time period. I don't want to do that. But when I looked at the life of Dorothy Draper, which I'll tell you guys kind of how I came to that in a second, I needed that. Dorothy Draper grew up as a Gilded Age heiress. She was basically an American princess. And she grew up in a society that, women did not work, for instance. It would have been like, nowadays we're so used to Paris Hilton, the Paris Hiltons of the world who are heiresses and entrepreneurs. And that just did not happen. If you were a working woman during that time period, especially if you were someone of the caliber of Dorothy Draper, her maiden name was Tuckerman. She came from iron heirs on one side and shipping heirs on the other. And she was their family was right on par with the Astors and the Vanderbilts, people like that. And they were New York high society. To have her go from, heiress to CEO during that period of time was revolutionary. And so anytime I see someone do a 180 like that, I always have to discover how. And I kind of wanted to show that in the book. So that's why I did two different time periods. Now, when I tried to figure out for years and years and years, when I first started writing, I knew I wanted to write a book set at the Greenbrier. And I would look over the books, the history books that Dr. Conti, who was the Greenbrier's longtime historian, wrote. And every time I would think to myself, I really don't know how I'm going to choose what to write here. There's so many stories to tell. And one family reunion, I was sitting with both of my grandpas, and we were hanging out in the Victorian writing room right off of the Greenbrier lobby. We were having high tea. And if you do visit the Greenbrier, if you have visited the Greenbrier, that's something that is so unique to that property. Every day at 3:00, you go to the lobby, everyone has high tea. It's just a wonderful time. A piano player is playing beautiful music. And so I was sitting there with my grandpas. I had just come off a history tour. I think it might have been like my 80th, who knows. I would always go on the history tour. I knew about what he was going to say, but I wanted to hear it anyway. There was always some variation. And I love history, of course. So I had to go hear him every time. And I just kept lamenting to my grandpas, I don't know what time period to choose. And I told them too, I said, I don't know which mouthpiece is best. I don't know who to tell the story, like whose point of view I want to tell the story from. And my maternal grandpa, grew up in Burlington, North Carolina. His dad was a ribbon mill manager. He started at the bottom, and they had an outhouse and a 1-bedroom, and worked his way up to managing a ribbon mill in White Sulphur Springs. At the time, my grandpa was playing football at Duke, and he was an engineering student when his dad moved to White Sulphur. And he came home for the summer, and they were redoing the Greenbrier. It was 1946, excuse me. And they said, we need help installing a fire alarm system at the hotel. Would you like this job? And he said, okay. And when we were sitting there having tea, he recounted that he had seen some of Dorothy Draper's things coming through the Greenbrier, and he'd seen the transformation. And that I thought to myself, I always have something very personal to me that goes into my books. It's usually family related. It just ties the care and my spirit to the book. And this was kind of my tie-in beyond being an honorary West Virginian, I would call myself. So I chose 1946. I knew from the get-go that I was going to choose that time period because I knew I was going to talk about Dorothy. This was number one, her largest project to date, and her masterpiece. But it also, for the Greenbrier, was a really extremely interesting turning point, because the Greenbrier had gone from a World War II Army hospital called, why am I blanking on it right now? I talk about it all the time. I don't know, but it was an Army hospital, and I'll remember the name of what they called it in a second. But it was completely stripped of all of its former glory. So it went from being that resort that the elite went to, that the top government officials came to being an Army hospital, completely stripped of everything. When World War II was over, the government said to the C&O Railroad who owned it, do you want to buy it back? Thankfully, they said yes. And Robert Young, who was the CEO at the time, his wife was a fan of Dorothy Draper's, and she hired Dorothy Draper for a couple of reasons. One, because she was a socialite and she knew a lot of famous people and could get everybody back to the Greenbrier. And two, because her designs were so wild that the papers were going to talk about them no matter what, whether they hated them or whether they loved them. And so I knew that 1946 year was so pivotal for Dorothy and for the Greenbrier. So I knew that was set in stone. But I wanted to show Dorothy as the heiress that she grew up, because I felt like I wanted to show that change. We all have that growing up. All of us that end up using our gifts or find it difficult to use our gifts, we have that point in our lives where we have to choose to use it or to lose it, really. And I wanted to show that time in her life where someone saw her gift and it changed her life. And somehow she was empowered to go from heiress to CEO. And when I was looking, I knew I wanted to set it somewhere between when she would have been 18 to 21. And Dr. Bob Conti, who is a historian at the Greenbrier, told me, he said, Joy, I have a complete booklet of all of the social events that went on during the 1908 season if you want it. And they called it the Centennial because there was a bar on the property and it was 100 years from when that first, structure beyond the cottages was there. So, what, I guess they just wanted an excuse to party is what I was thinking. But this woman that was there staying wrote down every single event that happened during that season. And I love in my fiction, still in my historical fiction, to be as accurate as I possibly can with everything. So I was so thankful that I got to use that material when drafting the 1908 section of the book. So that's kind of how I ended up, dialing in on those two time periods.
I have to tell you, Joy, we have one particular member who is on today, who we can't see because it's a webinar, who is so excited to be here today. And her name is Martha Fortson. And Martha is married to a great-grandson or a great-great-grandson of the Finnessees, who you feature in the book, right?
Yeah.
So he can remember his great-grandparents talking about going to the Greenbrier and the Finnessees. And so she was like, oh my gosh.
Wow.
So one of our members is married to, one of the wealthy families that you feature in the book, particularly in 1908, but I think they're featured again back in 1947.
Yeah, it was so fun because when I write these books, of course, when I use names, they're not the real people, they're the fiction people version. And I do that with my own family too. I have 2 books out that are straight from my family history. And I tell my grandma all the time, I'm like, I hope I do them honor. I hope I get them sort of right, but it's also fiction. But yes, it was so fun to look at these names because I had a full catalog of everyone that was there that season. And to look and see, who they had been and get to like kind of be among these people that I'm never going to get to know. It was the coolest thing ever. And I just really, I'm happy to share copies of that too, if anyone is interested, because Dr. Conti scanned it for me. So I have that book available if anyone's interested in looking at that too.
That's terrific. So how did you pick, before we talk a little bit more about Dorothy Draper and why she changed American interior design forever and was probably one of the most famous interior designers of the 21st century. Talk about how you decided that historical fiction would be your genre.
I danced around it for a very long time. Growing up, my mom and dad read us the classics. So it would be, for language primarily. My mom was an educator and still is. And she believed that reading us aloud classics like The Black Stallion and Little Women and The Secret Garden, that it would enhance our vocabulary and therefore our writing and our creativity. And so I remember from a young age just being really enthralled by that. And even today, when I pick up a book to read, I look at the classics. I'm like, what haven't I read yet? Because the language is so rich. And I realized as I was getting older and I had forgotten, as a kid, I always wrote, and you hear this a lot from authors. Usually authors start writing from a very young age. And I did the same. I wrote as a kid. I was creative as a kid. I wrote magazines and stories and things like that. And then I got to high school and college, and I just knew I wasn't good at math, that I was great at writing, not great at math. And I read a lot, but for some reason it just slipped my mind. I didn't really know why, but I never considered being an author as a career choice for me. So I graduated with a PR degree. I ended up being in public relations and marketing for a while. And one summer, I just decided I'm going to try my hand at writing a book. And the first book I wrote was based loosely on my family history in Rye, New York. It's my grandma's side of the family. She's kind of our matriarch of ancestry. She is carries on our family legacy very, very well. And I was always interested to hear what she had to say. So I set it there, and it was 2 books too long. I made a lot of mistakes, and it was actually a dual timeline. It was a contemporary timeline and it was a historic timeline. And of course, I made a lot of mistakes in that book. I was just still learning, and it went really nowhere. So I started dabbling in, contemporary romance as my second. And then the next book I wrote was kind of a speculative fiction. And it wasn't until my fourth book where I wrote my first straight historical that I felt my heart was truly on the page. And I just fell in love with that. And so that got me my first agent and my first book deal. And the rest is history. I'm really just a history nerd, and that's why I love it so much.
We had Joy, you don't know this, but we have quarterly lunches, big quarterly lunches. Our 60-year-old Constitution calls for that. And we had one of those last week. One of our, we kick off our season in September, and then we have an event in December, February, and big event. We have like 800 little events during the year, but these are the big events. So anyway, last week we featured Patty Callahan Henry.
Oh, I love her.
And yes, she was great. And her recent book, The Secret Book of Flora Lee. But she said, she was a romance novelist and wrote like 10 or 15 books that way before she went into historical fiction. And I love her quote that she said that writing historical fiction felt like coming home to her.
You can tell too, her work is so good. And she blurbed my most recent book, which was so nice of her. But I've had occasion to meet her so often, because we're all in the South together, and just a lovely person and an even lovelier writer. I just adore her work, but I really get what she's saying, because I feel the same way about it.
Well, and when you read her books, and I don't mean this to be about her, but you can tell she's matured so much in her historical fiction, and she's a much better historical fiction writer than she is a romance novelist, I think, frankly. And so, she finally found her genre. So is that the way you feel about historical fiction, that now you're home?
Absolutely. I've always written it professionally. That's all I've ever written. I do have a contract to write a contemporary small town romance, and it'll come out in fall 2025, but I will also have a historical out in spring 2025. So I told my agent, I said, I will always write historical fiction. I'm too interested in it not to. I will do research about random things that are never going to be a book, because I'm just fascinated by history. So I don't think I'll ever be able to get away from it rather, because it truly is really one of the loves of my life is learning more about history, and getting to tell those stories just allows me to feel the way people felt back then. There's a saying that says, you read nonfiction to learn something, and you read fiction, historical fiction, to feel the way people felt during that time period. And I completely agree. So yes, absolutely. I think I'll always write it.
Yeah, excellent. So let's talk about Dorothy Draper, because that book is really an homage to Greenbrier, but really through the life of Dorothy Draper. What made her such a celebrity as a designer, and so avant-garde is the word I was looking for as a designer? Talk about that.
Well, I think you have to look at two things when you consider Dorothy Draper, because on the one hand, she was, as I mentioned, an American princess. She grew up in Tuxedo Park, New York, which was basically, if you can envision all of the Fifth Avenue mansions in New York during the Gilded Age in a neighborhood, in, in suburban New York. If you can imagine that. That was what Tuxedo Park was like. It was, as a child, she thought she was free. She was running through the woods as a child. Her parents didn't really care what she did. She tore her dresses. She thought she was free. And then she gets presented to society and she realizes that there are expectations, and she realizes kind of who she is, which is she's trapped. And she realizes Tuxedo Park has a fence around it too. And she went from that lifestyle, which was very high profile. Now, this was back before her parents grew up, a little bit before the Vanderbilts came on the scene. So her parents, she was born in the 1880s, late 1880s. And of course, the Vanderbilts kind of come on the scene in the 1890s. And people of older money back then, the reason they lived in Tuxedo Park was because they wanted to be away from the spotlight. They didn't want people talking about them. It was actually considered really poor form to be in the papers. You tried to avoid it as much as you could. And so she did, but people were talking about it anyway. You're wealthy, you're known, and regardless of how well you try to stay out of the spotlight, that's really what the papers talk about. It's the celebrities of the day. So Dorothy grew up as a celebrity, pretty much. And
she was kind of like Kim Kardashian.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, she was just she was followed just like the rest of them were. Their lives were fascinating. They had endless money, it seemed, and lived the life of totally of the wealthy and gilded during that time. And she, because of that, she knew celebrities. She was always, throughout her whole life, right now, they were the same. Hang out with Bing Crosby, no problem. Friends with Judy Garland, yes, absolutely. Friends with the Kennedys, yes. So she was not only somebody who was an entrepreneur, but she also offered this access to celebrity on her own. And then when she started working, it could have gone the opposite direction, and it could have caused a huge scandal, which it did at first. But what people started to realize is her design work was interesting, and her design work either elicited joy or it elicited shock. And either way, it was going to be in the papers. And the reason she kind of, for those of you who haven't seen her design work before, it is bright, huge floral chintz on the walls or big stripes of bold colors. And she did different kinds of combinations. But either way, it's something that you can't miss when you walk in a room. And, she, throughout her life, she lived through World War I, World War II, the Depression, and a high-profile divorce from her physician husband, who actually was the polio doctor. Polio. Yes, polio doctor to FDR. And
He was President Roosevelt's polio doctor.
Yes, he was very well known. But his first love was studying disease, so he was gone a lot. And then on the verge of the Depression, he comes home from Europe, and where he's been studying, and he asks for divorce from Dorothy. And then he ends up marrying a fellow designer in New York City who's 20 years her junior, who apparently was a lovely person. But even so, Dorothy goes through all of this stuff. And when you read a lot more about her, you realize that she was truly an empath. So I remember I wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal about this, actually. Going through COVID, we had a similar-ish experience, right? All of us had to go through this together collectively, and it affected us all differently. But regardless, it was a trauma. And with Dorothy, having all these series of events happen to her, watching friends completely lose their fortunes, watching her friends not come home from war, having to deal with the high-profile divorce where actually she had to go to Vegas to get divorced, and they followed her around instead of Dan, even though he'd been the one to ask her for the divorce. And they took pictures of her, and she was in the papers. Oh, look, there's Dorothy Draper getting her divorce. And she was just put under a microscope, and she was constantly scrutinized. And I think that what happened to her is she started realizing that I can't control what's going on in my life. I can't control these external things. What I can control is my outlook. And she was a huge student of the power of positive thinking, that she fully believed in it, which interestingly enough, her husband really believed that the key to healing was positive thought as well. And so when she starts designing things, I think she does it truly because she's thinking to herself, yes, I can't change anything going on in the world. I can't really help wars starting. But what I can do is I can help somebody smile for a second when they walk into a room. And that was really her mission throughout her career as a designer. So I do believe she liked the fame. I do believe she liked the idea that people loved her work and adored her. But I also think beyond that, she saw it almost as her mission to paint places in joy instead of sorrow.
Yeah. And she also, the book also talks about, though, because she had big projects that she undertook that ran into financial difficulty and she didn't get paid, how precarious her financial situation was also.
Mhm.
And the struggles there that she had as the CEO of a famous design firm. And I think you do a good job of communicating that she was not only a famous designer, but she was a really good businesswoman.
Yes, absolutely. She always said one of the most famous sayings of Dorothy's is, if it's right, it's right. Meaning, if I think it's right, then it's right. And she truly was someone who stuck by her. She believed in her vision unapologetically, and that really did serve her well. But she went through a lot of bumps along the way, financially, because she had, as I mentioned in the book, she had this resort in Brazil that was supposed to be her masterpiece. And when the war broke out, it was a gambling resort. And when the war broke out, Brazil outlawed gambling and the resort was unfinished. And, it took years and years and years to do and still unfinished and unpaid. And then the Greenbrier came along. And to this day, it's still a museum to her, I would say. So
Yeah.
it worked out.
So give us some idea. How long did you do I know you love the research part. So how long did you do the research? And then how long did you write? Give us that timeline.
It's hard to tell with this book because, as I mentioned, I had been going on history tours of the Greenbrier. I had all the research books in my library for at least a decade prior to writing this book. But as far as, I knew a lot about the Greenbrier. I didn't know so much about Dorothy Draper, to be honest. So when I came home from that trip I mentioned with my grandpas and on our family reunion, I started diving right in. And it probably took me about, I probably did about 6 months of research just on Dorothy Draper before starting to develop the book. As I mentioned, I like to take everything in history that's true. And what I do usually with my historical fiction is there are always questions in history. There's always these little gaps. And I fill those gaps in those question marks with fiction. And so it's always fun. And then my writing process, it probably takes me, I usually have a really good outline when I start. So it usually takes me between about 4 and 7 months to have a first draft.
Wow. Wow. So this took place over 13, 14 months, your intensive research, and then your writing.
Mhm.
Wow. Wow. And at that point, did you have an agent who wanted the book?
Yes. So I actually switched agents. The reason if you guys ever see my publication history for my books, I have a book that came out in 2016, a book that came out the year after that. And then there's a gap, and sorry, my dogs are barking. But there's a gap, and that's because I was looking for a new literary agent. My agent stopped representing historical fiction, didn't have really any contacts. And so we just decided to kind of part ways, but I found a great one. It just took me a while. I wanted to be sure that whoever I chose for the future was someone that would represent everything that I wanted to write about.
Yeah. Excellent. So, what do you have what are you working on now? I'm impressed that you're talking about books into 2025 and 2026. So it sounds like you have commitments quite a ways out.
I do. I actually had a 4-book deal, which is really fun. And I love my editor and my team. So I was really excited for that. I do have a book coming out next year. It's called What the Mountains Remember. It is set at another famous historic resort and hotel called Grove Park Inn in Asheville.
Oh, yes, Grove Park in
Um,
North Carolina.
Yep, it's a little different because I didn't want to write something just like the Grand Design where it was in its heyday and everything. So it follows a girl who she's the stepdaughter of a gasoline magnate from Indiana, and they're camping with the Vagabonds. If you guys know anything about that, that's actually Thomas Edison, Harvey Firestone, and Henry Ford's camping trip. Her stepdad has been asked along because he wants to initiate gas stations, basically, because the wells are drying up in Indiana. And so what happens is he ends up taking along his family. The whole family's invited, and Belle goes along. And when you first meet her, she's encountering the mountains for the very first time in 5 years because she's from West Virginia. Her father actually passed away in a coal mining accident. And so she's got all these emotions going into it. But through a series of events, she's asked to write a story about the building of the Grove Park Inn, highlighting specifically the workers, the talented workers that are building it. And it's about kind of whose story lives on, and it's about whose story is worthy of being told. So I hope you guys will enjoy it if you read it. I'm really excited about it.
Grove Park Inn is another historic hotel you should visit. So historic hotels are becoming your thing.
I just
we
love it.
thank
You get to spend some time there, even when you're not on vacation, which is really fun.
Yeah. So thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. And we look forward to your next book. I can't wait to read it. Thank you very much, Joy.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joy. Hey, Janet. That was interesting. And I'm excited about her next book.
Well, I'm excited. I have to tell you, I just booked a meeting at the Grove Park Inn.
You're kidding.
For a professional group that's going there in the summer of 2024. And what we didn't mention is they have a wonderful spa.
Yes.
And a wonderful
yes.
And it's got everything. So I'm going to go to the hotel with completely and experience it with completely different eyes from this. So it's great to see you again, and thank you for doing such a good job for us, Robin. You've been there since the very beginning, and we appreciate you so much.
Thank you, Janet. You always do a wonderful job. Joy Callaway there was a very interesting conversation about her historical fiction novel, and we want to remind everyone that on November the 9th, okay, put that on your calendars, November the 9th, we have the William Kent Kruger with his latest book, which is not actually out as yet. And the book is called The River We Remember. And as Janet said earlier, it's her favorite author. She's read every single book that he's ever written. So make sure to put that on your calendar for November the 9th. I would assume that is a Thursday because we always do our author series editions on Thursdays. And we want to thank all of you for joining us. I want to thank the women of Wahi for doing a great job and everything you're doing with programming for the 2023-24 season. And you're making those connections with so many community groups. So congratulations, and we'll see you on November the 9th, everyone. And again, thank you, Janet. Thank you, Bobby Helbig, for everything you do to schedule our authors, and of course, Nancy Fowler for being our technical genius, and all of you for joining us. We had a good group of ladies today joining us. So thank you for participating in this 32nd edition of the Wahi Women's Association author series. Have a good weekend, everyone. It's going to be a little bit cooler, so enjoy. Bye-bye.